We already have completed the cusp to marginal ridge portion. So the next one we're going to do is the cusp to fossa occlusion on the right side. And as usual, we're going to start by preparing the planes of the teeth so that we're going to have an easier time adding the anatomy, adding the occlusal anatomy. So we're just going to complete the tooth structure in interproximals. Since these models were prepared for onlays, we're going to flatten out the occlusal portion of these preparations so that it will be easier for us to add the different color waxes and complete our morphology of the occlusal surface. As we can see, we're trying to just complete the outer periphery of the interproximal surfaces, since that's where we have missing tooth structure. We must make sure that we have contacts between these teeth so that when we build up the marginal ridges, we won't have any problem building them very close together. Contacts must be established between the adjacent teeth that we are not going to wax also. After we finished adding the wax, we're going to make sure that we add the Embrasure Spaces to help us guide our placement of the wax so that the proper contours of the teeth are achieved. but we should make these areas flat so that when they receive the wax we have adequate amount of space and also an even amount of space, which will also make it easier for us to add the right amount of wax. So let's try to approximate the shape of these teeth so that we can add the proper wax. Okay, so here we go. We completed that. This is the mandibular and this is the maxillary. So now we have to decide where we're going to place the cusps. So we know that the cusps on the mandibular, which if we take a look at the size of the teeth, we can kind of approximate where the cusp tips will be just from the position of the lobes. We also know that the cusp tips must end up in the central groove areas of the maxillary teeth, which will be right about here. So the cusp tips on the lower, right here, will have to line up with the central groove of the maxillary teeth, which will be here. So those points will have to match up with your line. Now on the upper teeth we can basically approximate the same way. We have the lobes of the upper molars, which we have right here, and then this will be our oblique ridge right there. So this will be our mesiolingual lobe, and then the distal lingual lobe. On the premolars we have our buccal lobe right here and the lingual lobe. Buccal lobe and lingual lobe. So since we can approximate that, then we know that our cusp tips should be about here. On the linguals of the premolars should be a tiny bit forward towards the Mesio, and then the cusp tips on the buccals will be lined up with the cusp tip of the canine and the cusp tip of the last molar here. So on this line will be our cusp tips. So if we want to approximate it, it should be around the center area, which will be here, there, and here's the mesiobuccal lobe, so it should be the center of about there, and the distal buccal lobe, the center about there, which will match up with this line if we connect the tip of the canine to the tip of the last molar. So it will line up right there. Okay, so on the mandibular, we're going to line up our cusp tips accordingly. So we have our lobes here. So Mesio buccal lobe, distal buccal lobe, distal lobe, and then we have the mesiolingual, distal lingual. So all of these will line up with the canine cusp tip and the last molar cusp tips. But we also have to make sure that these cusp tips also line up with our central grooves of the maxillary teeth. So when we start waxing, I usually start waxing on the lower. So on the mandibular, we're going to start waxing the little cusp tips on the buccal, and we must make sure that they go toward the central grooves of the maxillary teeth. So we're going to start with the white wax, and we're going to start placing them on the lower, and we're going to make them about 1/2 millimeter away. Actually, it's more than 1/2 millimeter, so because we removed quite a bit. So maybe we'll go about 1 millimeter away from the opposing teeth. Make sure that our little cusp tips stick to the stone. In fact, let's do one more thing. Let's take some wax and heat it up real well, and let's cover the surface of the stone with a very, very thin layer of wax, but make sure it's very hot. Because if it's not hot enough, it's not going to get absorbed in the stone, and which we want it to happen, because that way the wax that we add will stick a little better. Alright. Another thing we must remember is that these cusp tips should, as they line up with each other and with the other teeth, is that we need to make sure that they also are compatible with the curve of Spi. So if we notice the canine here, and this cusp tip will be a little lower, and it's going to form a curvature, and that will come up by the end of the last molar. So let's close the articulator and let's see where we are. So since we are going to be doing cusp to fossa on this side, we must make sure that not only these cones line up with the central grooves of the maxillary teeth, but they are also about the same area as the mesial fossas of the maxillary teeth, which will be right about here and right about here. So it's going to have to be aligned with the center right here, but also with Mesio, the mesial portion of the tooth, because that's where the mesial fossas will be located. So as we can see, we are right about there. These are pointing right to the mesial fossas. If we point this too far mesial, we might end up with a cusp to marginal ridge occlusion, which that's not what we're looking for on the right side here. So let's keep on moving. These cones. Now they should be about 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters tall. You can stop building it up when you think that you reached the curve of Spi. Let's get a different background for this so that we can observe a little bit better. Okay, this should be better. So if we look at this, we need to get the curve going. This might be a little bit even too extreme, so we're gonna raise the height of this cone right here and this cone right here. Okay, so now this one might be a little bit too tall even, so let's shorten it a little bit. And then we can add the distal cone. Remember, the distal cone may or may not come into occlusion. So let's check the lineup. So if we take a look at this, we can see that the cusp tips on the premolars look just about right. They're pointing right towards the central groove and towards the mesial fossas of the maxillary teeth. Now we see the cusp tips. They're just about the right height, so we have these done. So the next thing we do is we're going to figure out exactly where we're going to put the maxillary and buccal cusp tips. So we're going to loosen up the left condyle, and we're going to shift just like we did in the previous project. So we're going to shift the canines into a tip-to-tip position, which will give us an opportunity to locate our cusp tips for the maxillary. So to do that, what we have to consider is that as we're moving in an excursion, the cusp tips cannot come together in the same line, because if they do, they're gonna knock each other off. So the cusp tips on the upper have to miss the cusp tips on the lower. So we're going to locate the cusp tips in the center of our buccal lobe on both sides, and if we take a look at that little line in the center, we see that they miss the cusp tips on the mandibular. The cusp tips on the mandibular molars will also move between the cusp tips of the mandibular buccal lobe and distal buccal lobe. So this is the mesio buccal lobe, distal buccal lobe. So mesio buccal cusp, distal buccal cusp. Cusp tips on the maxillary will go right in between the cusp tips of the mandibular. Same thing on the distal buccal cusp of the maxillary. It will ride between the distal cusp and the distal buccal cusp of the mandibular. So let's add those cusps, and let's lock up the articulator first to make sure that nothing is moving while we're waxing. So we have a good background. Okay. Let's make sure this is in focus. Okay. Let's heat this up and let's put some wax on there. Seal up all the surfaces. Don't put too much wax so you could still see your dots. Make sure the wax is nice and hot. Okay, So now we're gonna add the cones. Let's add the little dots first. This way it'll make it a little bit faster. So we have to do the same thing here as we did. On the mandibular. With the maxillary you also have to follow the curve of Sp. So as we put our cones in, we must consider the length of the cusps on the canine and the last molar. We need to increase the length a little bit more. Let's see. So now we put them on. We have to take a look and see if we line these cusp tips up correctly. So we draw a line from here down there and line them up with the second molar's buccal cusps. We can take a look at it from the front also to make sure that we're not too far in or too far out. It looks like we may be a little bit far in with the second premolar there because it's a little bit close to the lower facial surface, especially on the second premolar. So let's move that out slightly and then we will continue with the rest. So what we can do is we can just heat it up slightly and we can push it out a little bit with our thumb. And now it should be okay. Let's just tweak it a little bit, make it a little bit more slender. Okay, so next thing we do is loosen up again our left condyle And let's see how our excursion is doing. So if we move to the side, we can see as the teeth come apart, they also miss each other. Now the upper second premolar looks like it might be a little bit close, so we could move it slightly distally so that we can give that mandibular second premolar a little bit more room. Now we will move the maxillary cusp and not the mandibular cusp. And that is because we need our mandibular cusp in the maxillary mesial fossa. And we're not really concerned much about what our maxillary cusp is doing. So we're just going to move it slightly more distally. Oops, broke it. Let's add a little bit more. This time I added a little more distally. So let's double check our position. Okay, now we're talking. Okay, so now we have positioned our buccal cusp tips both on the maxillary and mandibular. So let's move on to the lingual. Now on the lingual, we have to position the lingual cusp tips on the maxillary to the central groove of the mandibular. So we're going to draw a central groove, and we're going to position the lingual cusp tips right onto the central grooves. Now let's first move our condyles back and lock them. And what we need to make sure of is that our lingual cusps on the maxillary teeth go right into the distal fossa of the mandibular premolars, and the mesiolingual cusp will go into the central fossa of the lower molar, and the distal cusp tip right here will go into the distal fossa of the mandibular, or could also go to the marginal ridge of the mandibular molar. So let's start doing the lingual cones. Now what we have to remember is that the lingual cusps on the upper molars are longer. So these cusp tips that we're doing with these cones are also going to be longer. Longer than the buccal cusp tips or the buccal cones. Now we have to make sure that these cusp tips are properly positioned, so we need to check every time we put a cone on, so that when we go into an excursion we don't knock it off. So we have that lingual cone positioned, so let's take a look at it, see if it's in the right place. So we have that lingual cone. Let's see. That looks just about correct. So it should point right to the central fossa. So now, again, we have to loosen up our condyle, and let's see where that cone is during our excursion. So at this point, since that is a maxillary working cusp, we have to loosen up the right condyle, because we will want to do the excursive movement toward our working side. So as we move up, we notice that that lingual cone there is moving right between the distal buccal cusp and the distal cusp of the maxillary, of the mandibular first molar. Now we're going to lock up the condyle again, and we're going to place the lingual cusps. We're going to place the lingual cusps on the premolars, or the lingual cones. And we're going to check each time, make sure we are in the right place. And this particular cusp, we're going a little bit too far into the center part of the lower first premolar. We are going right about here, and now we have to move this a little bit more distally. So even though I would like to place this more mesio, we need to place it a little bit more distal because of our positioning of the lower tooth. So let's go a little bit more distal. And see where we are. Let's do it again. so everybody can see. Alright, so we're going to place that cone a little bit more distal to that red dot. Let's make sure we don't put too much wax, just a little bit. So let's check. Now we are a little bit too far to the lingual, so we're going to shift it a little bit closer to the central groove. We can just soften this wax a little bit and just push it over a smidgen. We can double check. Okay. Now we're in the right place. So our cusp tip should be right about there. So let's continue waxing to the second premolar. So we're going to also do the same thing. We're going to put it slightly more distally. And slightly more centered. So we have it a little more distal and the point a little bit closer to the center of the tooth. So we're going to double check, make sure this is down right, and we're just in the right place with that. Can probably move it a little bit more to the Mesio. Next one we're going to do the distal lingual cusp, or distal lingual cone. This one doesn't need to be so high. So if we look at it from the side, we can see that the lingual cusps are a slightly bit taller. So we can double check again by loosening the right condyle and shifting the tooth. And as we can see, we take a look at the lingual cusps, they are sliding right in between the cones. We want to make sure that none of these cones knock each other down. So if we look at it from the side, like this, all the cones miss each other. Okay, let's lock up the articulator again. Incidentally, as we notice, as we were sliding through the excursion, we got a little wear facet on these cusps. And what that means is that those cusps were in interference. they had a lateral interference, which means that these cusps, we waxed them a little too long, so that they were in the way of these lingual cusps as they were moving through lateral excursions. So that's just a little tidbit on why we need to make sure that those lengths of those cusps are properly gauged. So let's move on to the lingual cusps on the mandibular. The lingual cusps on the mandibular are going to be placed in line with the last molar, or the second molar on the mandibular, and kind of getting narrower as we move on towards the mesial and the first premolar. Now these are important to be the right length because these are balancing contacts. We have to remember that the lower dentition has their lingual cusps shorter than the buccal cusps. So it is especially important not to make them too long, because of those balancing interferences. The balancing interferences are the interferences that are on the opposite side of our working cusps. Let's remind ourselves that on the first premolar, the mesial cusp is the larger cusps. So the distal cusp on the mandibular second premolar is the smaller one. So we place that a little more distally so that we can give ourselves more space on the mesial portion of the tooth for the main cusp on the lingual. So now we move on to the lingual cusp of the first premolar. Now the first premolar is a very small narrow tooth that is very diverse in shape and size. The difference is that it is a very narrow tooth most of the time because it's a transitional tooth between the molars and the second premolar and the canine. Since this cusp is narrower, it gives the tongue a transition as it slides on the lingual surfaces of those teeth. If we make this first premolar too wide, the tongue will feel that difference between the canine and the premolar, and it won't be a natural feeling. So this premolar should be small, narrow, and the mesial cusp is almost vestigial in nature because it's so small, and some teeth don't even contain it. So it's just a tiny little cone that will not have a contact. Now we just have to make sure that these cones are not too high. So again, now we have to loosen the left condyle, because now we're going to go into a balancing side excursion so that we can see if there are any lateral interferences taking place, any non-working interferences taking place. So as we move into a lateral excursion, we must keep an eye on those lingual cusps on the lower, so that they do not crash into the maxillary lingual cusps. They should either miss each other, or they should clear each other cusp tip to cusp tip. The preference is that they should slide right past each other, not just tip to tip, but also mesio-distally. So if we go in, we can see that everything separates pretty well. So now we have all the cones in, and we are ready to move on to the next step, which will be the marginal ridges and the cusp ridges, and we will use the green wax for that. So the first thing we're going to do are the cusp ridges. Let's do that with the green wax. I used white by mistake. So at this point we're going to make sure that these look like the cusps of a tooth, which means we will need to make sure that these cusps have a nice shape, and they also have point angles. So after we place the cusp ridges on, from the buccal view, they should look like a tooth. Make sure the wax is well controlled. You can blow on the wax as you place it so that you can freeze it into place. So we have the cusp ridges on the mandibular. So let's do it on the maxillary next. And double check to see, make sure everything is pointing in the right direction again. Remember, you don't want to remove it once you started building up these cusps, because it's going to be extra difficult to redo it if you have to reposition a cusp. Now if you feel that a cusp or a cone is not long enough, you can build right over the cone with the green wax. The cones are really just for positioning purposes, so that we know exactly where our cusp tips are going to be located. So if we notice here, I feel that that tooth, that cone was a little bit short, so we can just build over with the green wax a little bit so that we can make that tooth look like the right height when we compare it to the canine. And we can slowly shape it too. We don't want the green wax too far out, because we're gonna use the blue wax to make the buccal contours. So we want to make sure that we use these only for the cusp, for the cusp ridges and the marginal ridges. Now if we break stuff, don't worry about it, just put it right back. The second time is usually faster than the first time, because you already know where to put it. Now if we take away too much stone from between the teeth, what's going to happen is we're going to have to build up more wax. And here I think we took away a little too much. Remember to line up the point angles as you're building the cusp ridges. Sometimes when you build some wax, while that piece cools down, you can start on another part. Because if I would have tried to put some more wax here while this one is still hot, they would have just flowed into one another. So this way we can just kind of place it without worrying about it, because that's already cool. So we have to check. You see, curves be nicely lined up. We can see the lingual cusp through the buccal cusps, because the lingual cusp is slightly more distal than the buccal cusps on the upper molars. So let's close the bite and see how we are doing. As we can see, our teeth are shaping up. They're starting to come together. We still have to kind of pay attention, see how much space we have, because if we take a look at those premolars on the maxillary, they're a little bit close to the buccals of the mandibular, which means that we're going to have to take away a little bit more from that lingual slope of those upper premolars, because we need the room to build the triangular ridges. So we can just take a look at it like this and take away a little bit from the lingual slopes here. Just make it a little bit thinner, just like that. And then we put it back together, and now we should have enough room. Maybe a little bit from that Mesio buccal cusp on the molar, and that might help us out a little bit too. And here. So we check it again, and we should be good to go. So now we're going to start building the lingual. So the lingual cusp ridges. And remember to follow the contour of the tooth. And create the embrasures as you're building the cusp ridges. Careful with the heating, because it can very easily start flowing if you overheat the wax. Let's make sure that our the length of those lingual cusps are a little bit longer than the length of the buccal cusps. So there we are, a little longer. Let's move on to the molar. So by the molar it should start shortening a little bit. So now, remember this is an upper molar, so this is going to be the oblique ridge. So we'll carefully place it. And we're going to start curving it towards the location of the distal buccal triangular ridge. And we do, this is going to be just a tiny bit, tiny little one, the distal lingual cusp. Okay, so now let's take a look to see if everything is pointing in the right direction. So let's take a look inside here. So everything is pointing towards the central groove, and the lingual cusps, they're pointing more or less into the distal fossas of the mandibular premolars. We forgot to tighten up our condyles, so we have to do that, otherwise it's gonna keep sliding on us. So let's see here, another check, see how everything goes through. Take a look at the lingual. The mesiolingual cusp goes right into the central fossa. That's what we want. So now let's move on to the cusp ridges on the mandibular. Remember, the same thing applies here. Except here, the lingual cusps are shorter. Okay, so here are our cusp ridges. Let's compare them to the lingual. So as we can see, the buccal cusp tips are longer than the lingual cusp tips. So the one thing I notice here is as we built the linguals on the lower second premolar, it seems to be the distal lingual cusp seems to be hitting a little bit on the lingual cusp of the maxillary. The maxillary second premolar. So I'm going to take that out of occlusion a little bit and make it slightly shorter so that it's not going to get into our way when we're doing the triangular ridges. This cusp needs to be a little smaller anyhow. So, alright, so the next step we're going to take is we're going to make the marginal ridges on the lower. And when we make the marginal ridges on the lower, we're going to start getting contacts on the maxillary lingual cusps. So we have to pay attention to that. At first sign of touch, we have to stop building it up. So we're going to start with the Mesio. Well, actually, let's first go into Excursion and see if we do come up with any interferences, because this is the time to figure that out. So we're going to loosen up the left condyle first, the right condyle first, and we're gonna see if we have any balancing interferences. And as we can see, we have good clearance because we have a nice canine rise on the left side. Then we're going to close this down and we're going to open up the left condyle and we're going to see if we have any working interferences. So we're going to take a look. We're going to slide this way now. So we can notice that these cusp tips miss each other. They more or less glide past the opposing cusp tips just to the distal, which is what we're looking for. And if you notice the molars, the molar cusp tips mesh together, they run through in between each other's cusps. Alright, so let's lock that condyle up and we're going to start building the marginal ridges. So let's go with the mesial marginal ridge first, right here, and making sure that we get contact to the adjacent tooth. Try to follow the tooth contours. And remember, the mesial cusp is very small. Recontour the embrasures a little bit to make sure that we have those embrasures. Then we close down this and we can see that there is not going to be a contact in that particular area. So the next one is going to be the distal. Distal marginal ridge. So let's go together with that. We broke off a cusp tip here, which signifies that, you see, the lingual cusp tip is gone. We had a very strong bite there, so I'm going to, just for saving of some time, is going to glue that back on there so that we don't have to rebuild everything. But we have to melt it together very well so that it doesn't come off again. That's why it's important to get a good coat of wax on there so that the wax stays on the model easier. So the fact that this broke off, what we need to do is we need to soften up the wax a little bit here to make sure that when we close it down, it doesn't come off. It is also possible that it broke off during excursion, so let's double check that excursive movement there. Okay, it is actually pretty good here, this way. So now let's close up this one and open up the other one again, because excursive movements can also very easily trip off that tooth. So let's very carefully slide this around and make sure the cusp tip doesn't touch, and it doesn't. So what this tells us is that that cusp tip probably broke off because it hit the opposing wax too hard. So if we look at the wax here, we do have a contact right in this spot, which is going to be directly from this cusp tip here. So let's move on to the next marginal ridge. So we're going to build this marginal ridge to the same level as that adjacent tooth is built. And then we're going to build a distal marginal ridge on this second premolar, and this is probably where we're going to get the contact from the opposing premolar. Let's make sure that that wax is softer so that when we close it together it can just create a little dimple. And We don't have contact just yet. So we're gonna build it a tiny bit higher and see what we get. Okay. So now we got a contact right here. But it tells us that this contact here is a little bit too lingual. So what we need to do is we're going to have to move this upper cusp tip here a little bit closer to the central groove. So we're gonna build it up here and take away a little bit from the outside here. Now it's going to give us less room to work with, when we build the triangular ridges, but it is a necessary thing. So to move that contact in more towards the central groove. So let's soften up this wax a little bit and then close it. Wait a little and open it. And let's see. The contact is still there, so that means that we're going to have to take this portion of the tooth in a little bit more, which incidentally will also give us that mesial lean a little bit more on that upper molar. So let's do this again. Soften up the wax, build up that area a little bit for the distal cusp. And then let's close it. Let's build it a little bit more. And it's a little bit closer to the middle. It's right here, which is okay. I can live with that. So the next one is going to be the mesial marginal ridge of the mandibular first molar. Don't be afraid to build it right up against that premolar. You can always use a tool to make them look separate. Let's build it up until we have the same level, and before it hardens we just kind of close it down and see. Now if we don't get contact on this molar here, don't worry about it, just build it even with the adjacent tooth, because we're going to get the contact in this molar in the central fossa, not necessarily on the marginal ridge. Let's go to the distal marginal ridge. It's going to be next. Again, right up against that tooth. Don't be afraid of it. Now we have to look at these teeth here, and we're going to compare the lingual cusps of this tooth to the lingual cusps that we built. So if it's not matching up with this tooth, and we consider also the curve of Sp, we have to bring these cusps up a little bit. Just whatever you do, don't bring it higher than the buccal cusps, because that's exactly when you get the balancing interferences. Remember, you can build over the white cones. And remember that the embrasures are what give your teeth the natural look, so that they are not blended together. Also remember, marginal ridges must be even. If they are not even, the patient's tongue will feel it, and it will feel uncomfortable for them. Remember the sound of the stone. If when you put the models together and you don't hear that, that means that your wax is too high and it's not allowing the stone to come together fully. Okay, so we have the lower. Now when we build the upper marginal ridges, we're going to have to pay attention to when the lower cusp ridges contact those marginal ridges, because that's going to be our mesial contact on our cusp to fossa occlusion. So again, we're going to start with the mesial marginal ridge of the first premolar. And we're going to close the opposing tooth. Do we have contact yet? No. And we're going to build it a little higher. Sometimes you may have to bring the cusp a little higher too, with the point angle here. Then close it again. Now with this marginal ridge on the mesial, on the upper, as we're finishing building it up, we may notice that we built it adequately high when compared to the canine. So at this point we may want to stop building, and if we do not have contact, then we may build a little bit higher on the mandibular premolar. Until we achieve some contact. But we have to make sure that the condyles are locked, obviously. So let's build it a little bit more on the mandibular premolar. Now we have contact right here, and we also have contact on this. We also have contact on this marginal ridge. What I did notice is that cusp tip I made a little bit too far forward, so it's hitting exactly on the marginal ridge, and we don't want that. This is a cusp to fossa occlusion, so we have to move that cusp tip a little bit more distal so that we start hitting in the mesial fossa of that maxillary. So let's just take this tool and we can carve down a little bit from the mesial of this tooth and add some wax to the distal portion to move that cusp tip towards the distal. So at that point, now we can see that cusp tip here is going right into that mesial fossa, which is exactly where we want it. We can still leave that contact point here on the mesial, because that contact point will be the mesial contact point in the fossa. We're going to have 3 contact points, one on the mesial distal area of the marginal ridge, and we're going to have 1 contact on the mesial area of the triangular ridge and the mesial area of the lingual triangular ridge. So let's move on to the distal marginal ridge. And we can build that a little higher, in fact a lot higher. Remember, we took off a lot from that tooth structure, so we have to build up some wax here. Alright, so sometimes you can notice that you're building a little bit too high, so you may get the feeling that you may want to build a little more on the lower cusp, which is what I feel that we should do with this at this point, because you don't want to bring that marginal ridge too high off the occlusal table. So let's add a little bit to the lower cusp. And to the cusp ridges. Let's see if we're getting close. Yeah, we're getting close. So we also have to take a look again to make sure that our cusp tips aren't getting too high. These areas could be a little higher here. This one I think is high enough, and these we can probably bring in higher later. But let's build up the marginal ridge on the second premolar and see what we get. Because that cusp tip on that second premolar that we built is pretty high. So this marginal ridge may allow us to gain contact, and most likely it will, because that cusp tip went pretty far up towards the fossa. So let's see. And yes, there's a little contact right exactly where we want it, right here. So we don't have to add any more to that. We're good with that. Now that cusp tip also should go a little bit more to the lingual, because we are hitting dead on onto the marginal ridge. So we're going to bring that cusp tip towards the distal. As we can see here, that cusp tip is more towards the mesial, and it should be a little more towards the distal. So let's take this, build up a little more on the distal here, and take away a little bit from the mesial there. And as we can see, we moved it a little more distally, so we can have that cusp tip moving closer to that mesial fossa on the maxillary. Since we took away a little bit from there, from the mesial incline, we can add a little height to this marginal ridge here. But do not add more, that it will overtake the height of this marginal ridge. So let's see, and we got contact again, just in the same place. And we move on to the distal marginal ridge. Now let's see where we are with the contacts. And again, as we can see, that particular contact is not going to happen. But we do have to lengthen the cusp on that molar. Which is also not bad, because that will also give us our ratio between the cusp lengths of the buccal cusps and the lingual cusps. And we want the lingual cusps shorter than the buccal cusps. Let's cool the wax down a little bit, and then I'm going to build up that. So now that's a little higher, we can go a little bit higher with our marginal ridges here. mesial marginal ridge of the maxillary first molar. Go right here. Let's see. And we got a little contact right in the central fossa right there. In the central groove area, not the central fossa. But let's see here. Yeah, so we'll move on to the distal marginal ridge. And let's close again. So on this one we'll just bring it up to line up with the distal, with the mesial part of the second molar. We don't want to make it higher, we want to make it exactly the same length. So we'll take a look, make sure all our cusps are lined up to where we want. All our marginal ridges are in contact where they're supposed to be. So we have a cusp to fossa relationship. The mesial cusps on the lower contact the mesial fossas. The buccal cusps on the lower go right into the mesial fossas of the maxillary, and we have the central, we have the distal buccal cusp going right into the center of the upper molar, and we have the upper molars going into the distal fossas of the mandibular premolars, and the mesiolingual cusp goes right into the central fossa of the mandibular first molar. So at this point we can start waxing the outside periphery of the teeth to prepare for our triangular ridges. So we're going to use the blue wax for that. So we're just going to wax the outside contours with the blue wax. Just don't heat it up too much, because we don't want to mess up our contours and contact areas. And also we want to hear the stone models when we close the articulator. We can overbuild it slightly so that when we carve it down with the spatula, we can make a nice flush finish line. When it flicks like that, it usually means that you didn't heat it up enough. So I can heat it a little more. And gently carve it back. And we want to do this gently because we don't want to break anything, because then we have to not just redo the shape or contour but also the contacts, which can be challenging at this stage of the game. if we're careful enough, we can preserve our embrasures, and the teeth will look like their preferred shape. That is why it's important that when we're filling up the little crevices or prepared areas in the teeth, that we should fill them up so that the little platforms that we make for ourselves can guide us in preserving those tooth shapes that are so important. Those tooth shapes also allow us to more easily obtain the contacts that we want. Can separate them a little bit and create occlusal embrasures as well as buccal and lingual embrasures. Now the gingival embrasures are more difficult to achieve because these two teeth aren't removable, so we can just basically go in there with our instrument and kind of try to shape those buccal embrasures a little bit and go in there and try to get some of that gingival embrasure. Just be very careful so we don't touch our contacts that we worked so hard to achieve. So on here, on the lower, we'll have the contact. We have one contact here, we have one contact there, and on the upper we have one contact on the mesial here, mesial marginal ridge, and one contact on the mesial marginal ridge of the molar. On the mesial marginal ridge of the first premolar we don't have one, but we can, actually we do have one. We have one right here, but our dimple is on the lower tooth, not on the upper. So as long as you show a contact here, I'm going to know that your contact is also opposing it. So here is our fish mouths, and this will allow us to get the rest of our contacts. We can widen these areas a little bit if we wish, and that will give us enough room to work and add our triangular ridges and secondary ridges and grooves. So we can just use our instruments and kind of make a little bit more room. Just be careful because we don't want to lose these contacts here. So when we're widening our contacts, when we're widening our fish mouths, let's pay attention to the contacts that we already have, so that we do not destroy them. And we can do the upper. In this area we can add a little bit more wax. Right there, just to fill in that empty area and create a contact. Then once that cools down we can reshape it. Now that we have some more wax, and here it's a lot stronger, so we can shape these a little bit more confidently. Shape our embrasures. But remember to make it appear like they are contacts. You shouldn't see openings. So it should have a nice effect, that like they are touching. This one here is still a little bit open, so we're going to put a little bit of wax in there to close up that contact. A little more. I'm just going to be very careful so that I do not lose this contact area. And we just separate it a little bit. And there we go. We have our fish mouths, and we are ready to start waxing the triangular ridges.